accepted the responsibility to protect.
Atrocity prevention.
Words kill.
All societies are potentially vulnerable.
Atrocity crimes.
Timely and appropriate action.
Welcome to Expert Voices on Atrocity Prevention by the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. I'm Jacqueline Streifeld Hall, Director of Policy and Research at the Global Center. This podcast features one-on-one conversations with practitioners from the fields of human rights, conflict prevention, and atrocity prevention. These conversations will give us a glimpse of the personal and professional side of how practitioners approach human rights protection and atrocity prevention, allowing us to explore challenges, identify best practices, and share lessons learned on how we can protect populations more effectively. Today I'm joined by Dirk Moses, Anne and Bernard Spitzer Professor of International Relations at the City College of New York and Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Genocide Research. Thank you for joining us today, Dirk.
It's great to be here.
Can you describe some of the misconceptions or common themes you've noticed in the discourse around modern-day commission of atrocity crimes, including genocide?
Sure. Unfortunately, there's all too much material to work with and talk about. People are concerned and occupied with what's happening in Ukraine and obviously in Gaza and Sudan, atrocities ongoing in Eastern Congo, ongoing situation with the Rohingya refugees from Myanmar, from the genocidal ethnic cleansing in 2017. There is a sort of winding down of the oppression of the Uyghurs, but it's still very grave in Xinjiang province in China, and there are many other places like civil war in Ethiopia as well. What I see as the main misconception regarding genocide, because that's the key or buzzword in all these cases, is its distinction or overlap with armed conflict. So if you look at the rival cases at the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, in the case brought by the Republic of South Africa against Israel for its campaign in Gaza, you'll see that the South Africans run a case that this is genocide. The genocidal intention is proven, they say, by the many statements by Israeli leaders. And then in response, the Israelis say this is an armed conflict and the laws of IHL, international humanitarian law, war crimes, crimes against humanity, apply. And in any case, we're not guilty of any of these things. But genocide consistently is distinguished in the legal and the public mind from armed conflict. Genocide is seen and is in legal and in the public mind as a criminal intention. There's nothing legitimate about it. Whereas a military intention, striking a military target, military objective, is not illegal when it's done in self-defense. And of course, it can result in so-called collateral or incidental damage, but as long as that's proportionate, it's not illegal either. I mean, the terrible secret of that dare not speak its name of so-called international humanitarian law is that it allows many civilian deaths. Now, in practice, my view is that genocidal and military intentions are entwined, entangled, commingled, overlap. But that's not conceivable for the law, as I see it as an amateur observer, as a non-lawyer, and in the public mind, where it's either a genocide, somehow resembles the Nazis, or it's an armed conflict and it's legitimate and there may be some unfortunate aspects to it. This issue bedevils the debate, particularly with respect to Gaza. And I wrote a book about how we got to this problem a few years ago in a book called The Problems of Genocide.
Along those same lines of where everything falls within conflict and what can be justified or what governments try to justify in the context of conflict. While many associate genocide with mass killings, the targeting of groups often involves policies and practices that deliberately attack their identity, history, religion, or culture. And, you already mentioned the Uyghurs, which is an excellent recent example of this. And perpetrators are increasingly, in recent times, justifying such means through the lens of counterterrorism or by kind of extensive propaganda campaigns to divert attention. To what extent do you think specific policies used to justify or mask potential genocide intent impact response by the wider international community?
Yeah, it depends very much on whether you can successfully frame it as a genocide or genocide-like atrocity crime or a legitimate security measure. I think you're quite right to focus on the security aspect, because states always justify what they're doing in terms of counterinsurgency, anti-terrorism, and so forth. The Chinese talked about the, actually quite small uh, incident, I think it's 2011, from some Uyghur separatists in Xinjiang as China's 9/11. And that was then a pretext to use the whole global war on terror rhetoric that the West was driving at that time to clamp down on a quite minor separatist movement in Xinjiang province, and to do so by not expelling the population, which is what we saw in Rakhine province in Myanmar, but incarcerating largely the suspected enemy population or securitizable population, because the logic is from the security apparatus or from the state is that while the majority of the population is complete innocent and bystanders, the insurgents or separatists come from that population and speak in the name of that population. So through what I call a policy of permanent security, they try to anticipate future insurgencies or separatist actions by targeting the entire population, which means you're also attacking women and children, non-combatants, as it were. And clearly that's illegal and illegitimate. But states don't think in those terms. When states think that their existence is imperiled, they will see very few limits, and then they move into this anticipatory domain, and that's when we see criminality of various types being committed, and you know there is a case before the ICJ on Myanmar, but no one's has any illusions that there'll be any legal action in international courts on China for obvious reasons, right? Which points to various asymmetries in the international system. So the security aspect is, as you say, is fundamental. Now, there are cases where the security rhetoric or rationale doesn't stick or it doesn't convince people internationally. So Myanmar is a case in point where there was a little separatist insurgency very similar to China, to the Uyghurs in Rakhine State. And as is also the case in Darfur in the early 2000s, it's local separatist groups are upset with the central government for various reasons and want local autonomy or set up a separate state. And then there's a massive reprisal by the central government, which veers into a genocidal direction. But when you read the UN report on Darfur, it's from 2005, I think, they settled not on genocide as constantly alleged in America. They say these were crimes against humanity and the crime of persecution, which also has this identity targeting, like in genocide. They use very similar language to the Genocide Convention, but it's persecution, not destruction, because the logic was that the targeting of battle-age men by the counterinsurgents, the Janjaweed and armed government forces in Darfur, was driven by, and I think the word they used was counterinsurgency measures, whereas then the shipping off of the women and children was not an aspect or dimension of a destruction policy, as you would have gotten, say, as the court concluded in the Srebrenica case. before that, but one of persecution. So the report balked at the genocidal hurdle, as it were. But in Myanmar, there's the case before the ICJ that this is genocidal. So I think geopolitics actually has a fair bit to do with it. Western states lined up to aid the prosecution case for the ICJ, before the ICJ with respect to Myanmar. And Canada, Germany, and various other Western states produced a memo for the court saying that the threshold of the number of children killed, I think it was children, should be lowered to count as genocide. Now, they're all sitting on their hands with respect to that argument for Israel and Gaza, because in one case, Myanmar is in the Chinese orbit and Israel is in their orbit. So unfortunately, one has to be rather cynical about how and why certain cases stick in various parts of the international system as genocide or as an armed conflict, and certainly as an internal matter that has nothing to do really with the Security Council and so forth.
As a scholar, you've been publishing on the Holocaust and genocide prevention for more than 2 decades, and as senior editor of the Journal of Genocide Studies, have been, deeply embedded in kind of the genocide studies academic community. In that time, have you seen any significant changes in how we collectively understand the risk for genocide and evolution of this crime in different country contexts?
The Journal of Genocide Research, which I edit, and there are other journals out there. There's one called Genocide Studies and Prevention, which focuses much more, obviously, as its title indicates, on the prevention issue, and it's more of sort of an activist journal. Is not a journal, so the one I edit, is not one which is seeking to advocate for intervention or non-intervention. Much more of a scholarly journal, although we publish topics on that topic, articles regarding R2P and so forth. Now, just to give you a bit of a history about the genocide studies field, so there was only one journal in the early 2000s, that's this journal, which was founded by Henry Hartenbach, who was a professor at City College as well. He passed away, sadly, just a few months, I think, the age of 95. He was a German-Jewish refugee scholar. And he was very much a comparativist. He was a historian of nationalities and so forth. And there was some tension within his generation of genocide studies scholars who, in a sense, founded the field in the 80s and the 90s about what was then called humanitarian intervention. This is well before the R2P language. And they were all moved by and appalled by what happened in the mid-90s and the early 90s in Rwanda and in former Yugoslavia. And many in that group became fans of Samantha Power and her book, The Problem from Hell, and very much American-led interventionists. And Henry was not one of those. Now, when he retired and he passed the journal over to a younger generation, included me, we were younger. 20 years ago, exactly, I think is when this occurred, 2005. There were members within the sort of the genocide studies community who were highly motivated to continue with this interventionist, liberal internationalist approach, and so they founded their own journal, this rival journal, Genocide Studies and Prevention. Now, a lot of those tensions are all past now, and everybody's very friendly. You've had generational change. But the result is that the journal I edit is far more interested in the causes and consequences of mass violence against civilians more generally, and observes analytically how, for example, claims of genocide are utilized in self-determination drives by non-state actors, especially in the Caucasus and the post-Soviet states. And we published an article about that a few years ago. So rather than taking claims of genocide for granted or as self-evident, and then asking, why aren't these being recognized? Isn't that outrageous? We're interested in the politics of genocide claims. I have a research project called The Diplomacy of Genocide. What actors are using the language of genocide or atrocity crimes, but mainly it's genocide as the so-called crime of crimes, because war crimes and crimes against humanity are regarded by them as second best, unfortunately. Ask Tamil activists, and you'll see this reaction. We ask, what's the politics and meaning of making these kind of claims? So it's sort of a super analytical level. Now, the moral imperative is no less urgent than in other parts of the genocide studies community, where we want to understand what are the causes and consequences of mass violence against civilians more generally. And what we're seeing is that the fixation on genocide can often get in the way. I mean, what one observed with the report about Darfur from the UN in 2005 was an audible sigh of relief from Khartoum and some members of the African Union who said, oh, as we said, there's no genocide here, nothing to see here, just crimes against humanity. I think that's an appalling outcome. Why aren't crimes against humanity as grave as genocide? I mean, that was certainly the case during the Nuremberg trials, when genocide wasn't one of the main indictments. It was war crimes and crimes against humanity. But, since then, genocide has, scaled the heights of international criminal law, or at least the moral and legal imagination people have of the ultimate criminality, and become the crime of crimes for people. So there's sort of this fixation on that. And our observation at the Journal is that can often get in the way of a focus on, what's really going on in this particular conjuncture. And in terms of prevention, because I know that's what you really want me to focus on, that's not an area I'm an expert on, but my observation is that in many, many cases, you have separatist or secessionist movements within post-colonial states where the borders were drawn by imperial powers. For example, Nigeria in the late 60s, you had the Biafra-Nigeria Civil War. Or a year later, in 1971, the secession of East Pakistan from Pakistan to create Bangladesh. You had cases like this in which there were enormous casualties, 1 to 3 million dying of mainly starvation in Biafra, 500,000 to 1 million, some say many more, in East Pakistan. Likewise, from the massive refugee flows, but also many killed by the Pakistani army. And at the time, genocide was alleged. These contexts, as you see now in Ethiopia and in Myanmar, and in the case of the Uyghurs, and also in Gaza, where you have a case of an occupation, slightly different, but there's still a similar dynamic of a separatist rival nation-state project. These are the crucibles for mass atrocity crimes. Now, why in particular are civilian populations implicated? It's because from the perspective of the government, the entire enemy, in a sense, separatist or separatizing, to invent a word, population, is the origin of the terrorism. That's the perspective of the state, and so is targetable or at least killable. I don't think that in many of these cases the states deliberately set out to kill women and children. They are often trying to get at the insurgents, but they're very cavalier about how many civilians they kill in doing so. And when push comes to shove, they're willing to expel entire populations in order to cleanse, quote unquote, land and territory from the possibility of future separatism. So I know that various research and university institutes have established checklists and criteria, thresholds, early warning systems, and so forth. I'm not an expert on those, a very technical matter in the end. but were one to apply those to, say, what's happening in Gaza, you would have reached to, very much to the top of the scale.
How has the situation in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory impacted the discourse around genocide and the consistent application of international humanitarian and human rights law across all contexts?
Well, it's led to a crisis in the field, but you have to also ask yourself, what exactly is the field? Does it include Holocaust studies? I mean, if you look at these centers on university campuses, they're inevitably called the Center for, Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Maybe human rights is thrown in there, and so forth. But it's a combination of these things. It's rarely genocide studies on its own. It's usually Holocaust and genocide studies for two reasons. First, Holocaust studies precedes genocide studies as a discipline. It got going immediately after the war, and then became institutionalized in subsequent decades, maybe a decade or so ahead of genocide studies, which is very much a latecomer. Uh, really got going, in the 90s with some roots in the 70s and 80s. And by roots, I mean a handful of scholars having a few conferences, poorly funded conferences here and there. It's really a very small academic, intellectual community, an activist community. Now, so that's one reason. That is that Holocaust studies precedes genocide studies, and that genocide studies, to some extent, derivative of Holocaust studies in the sense that the Holocaust is the archetypal or ideal type of a genocide. It was for many people the model. Well, for something to be a genocide, it needs to resemble the Holocaust. So that's one. The other issue is that the funding for Holocaust and genocide studies centers usually comes from local Jewish communities. Like if there's one in Dallas, then it'll be the local Dallas Jewish community. I mean, you have the Strassler Center at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. It has a chair in Armenian genocide as well, because you have a local Armenian community. Now, these communities aren't, just bystanders, and they're interested in what's happening in these centers. And I know anecdotally that from the people who run these centers, I'm not going to name any, but that if the graduate students start talking about the application of genocide as a law and as a concept to Gaza, that the funders of these centers aren't particularly happy, because their view is that we didn't give you millions of dollars to attack Israel. This is not the point of the exercise. So there's sort of a material crisis as well as a moral crisis in these centers for these two reasons. Okay, and it's on record that Professor Raz Siegel, who teaches at Stockton University in New Jersey, had a job offer withdrawn from such a center in the University of Minnesota because the local community was up in arms, because he wrote an article 6 days after the 7th of October called a textbook case of genocide in the Journal of Jewish Currents, and has been very active in this domain as an Israeli Holocaust scholar. I mean, he's eminently qualified. So I actually disagree with him on this textbook idea of genocide. I think the Holocaust is the textbook case of genocide, and that's why it's so difficult for other cases of mass violence against civilians to quote unquote measure up or to fit the ideal type, because if the Holocaust is distinct, unique, unprecedented, as people often say, well, then how are other cases supposed to be comparable or analogizable, right? Analogous. So that's another issue in the field as well. So Marie Cohen, a journalist at the Journal of Jewish Currents, wrote a terrific article a few months ago on the crisis in the field, for which she interviewed me in great length, and I'm quoted in there. So now the law is a different issue. The black letter lawyers stick to the law. They don't ask who wrote the law, why is the law this or that. They just say, here's the law. It's in effect a checklist, and then they say, does this checklist, these criteria, does it fit these facts? And then you have this argument between, for example, the Israeli team at the ICJ and the South African one about whether it fits the checklist or the criteria, and that's for the judges to decide in a few years. It certainly led to an activation of international lawyers in thinking about genocide. And I have observed, again, as I said at the outset, this inability for most people in the field to think beyond the stark contrast between armed conflict, which has its own body of law, and genocide. When in fact, if you look at the way genocides unfold, or let's without putting a label on it, the way mass violence against civilians unfolds, that genocidal and military logics are entangled or commingled, and they can't really be prized apart. Let me give you a concrete example. Now, as you know, the Genocide Convention, and this is reproduced in the Rome Statute of the ICC, says that genocide is the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, and I think racial or religious group as such, right? But it's the intent to destroy. And the Israelis argue we don't have the intent to destroy, we have the intent to defeat Hamas, or maybe to destroy Hamas, but not the rest of Gaza, not the civilian population. Okay, so if you look at the facts and you look at the photographs, Gaza is destroyed. It had been totally flattened. Universities, schools, mosques, and other civilian infrastructure has been destroyed, and it's hard to say, I think, plausibly, that each of these structures was destroyed as a military target, that in each of the tens of thousands of missile and tank and other strikes, that a Hamas operative was sitting in there, such as to justify its total destruction. This is a vastly disproportionate application of violence. And on the record, we have plenty of statements by Israeli leaders and by armed personnel, not to mention all the gleeful destruction of this infrastructure by IDF personnel that they advertise on social media while they're wearing, women's lingerie and playing with the toys of Palestinians in the houses they're occupying, etc. That in each of these cases there was an actual military threat. No, clearly not. No one can take this seriously anymore. And yet there is an armed conflict. Hamas is resisting. Obviously, it's a grossly asymmetrical armed conflict. But to say that there's not an armed conflict is also blind to the facts. I mean, Hamas and its supporters prize the notion of resistance. Now, once you get the notion of resistance, you're no longer in the realm of genocide according to its archetype, because there the victims are passive and agentless. And the exemplary victim in this archetype are the Jewish victims of the Holocaust, who weren't engaged in an insurgency. They weren't armed actors. Again, of course, there were Jewish partisans, but they were driven to the partisan movement by the Nazis. So the causation is backwards there. The Nazis weren't attacking Jews because they were in the partisans. It's the other way around. Now, the Holocaust is such a problematic archetype for genocide precisely because it does have these distinct features. And it's very difficult to analogize between what's happening in Gaza and the Holocaust. Okay, this very much plays into the Israeli side of the argument, and yet what we're working with is the law, and the law talks about destruction, and unquestionably destruction has taken place, and unquestionably there have been plenty of statements by Israeli leaders calling for destruction, and not just of Hamas. Okay, so what we're seeing is the combination of destructive intentions and military intentions, often in the same military action. Now, the court has to be able to see and understand this complexity rather than saying it's one or the other, because it's both at the same time.
Many countries are grappling with rectifying colonial or imperial wrongs done by their predecessors. We've got that dual push and pull where some governments want to deny the past and others are trying to grapple with the past. How is a refusal to fully acknowledge it and rectify past atrocities impacting populations today and creating a stumbling block for states in reacting to atrocities?
That's an interesting question. I mean, many states are grappling with their colonial pasts. The British, there's a fair bit of imperial nostalgia there. The Germans are, inching towards recognizing as genocide what imperial forces did in German Southwest Africa before the First World War, also in German East Africa in the Maji Maji uprising. Australia, the same. I wrote my first publications about genocide in Australia. I was very much a proponent of the genocide concept back in those days because I thought it could be useful for Indigenous activism, and it was, and remains so. But your question is more than, delineate this discussion in these realms, whether in France and Belgium, also in the Netherlands, where massacres that their troops committed in trying to reconquer Indonesia after the Second World War have been underway. You're interested in how these debates pertain to their recognition of genocide today. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that. I'm in touch with various colleagues in the UK who work in the R2P space, and I'm just observing, this Labor government and its conduct. And there you've got politicians who are more likely to recognise the problematic aspects of the British Empire. The apologists, the imperial nostalgics are tend to be Tories. However, even this Labor government is unrelenting in the arms it sends to Israel. There's an article about it today, and is very cautious in voicing any criticism about of Israel and breaching international law and saying it's starvation of Gaza right now. So the foreign minister made a statement to this effect, and then has had to walk it back when the prime minister didn't back him. So and there's tremendous frustration in the genocide or atrocity prevention community on regarding this, because as I said before, states are not driven by morality on these issues. It's a diplomatic game. It's the diplomacy of genocide. It's very simple. When your allies and supporters commit mass atrocity crimes, well, you don't criticize them. You might talk to them behind the scenes and say, well, I think you need to be more careful with your targeting. Otherwise, you're making it tricky for us to send you weapons because we have our own laws about sending weapons to states that are committing mass atrocity crimes and breaching human rights. So don't make it hard for us. In public, you'll have 100% backing, maybe criticism of one or two rogue politicians in those states, but 100% backing of the state. Meanwhile, you approve of the ICC's indictments against Vladimir Putin, while you condemn that same court's indictments of Israeli leaders. So I think these are very separate domains, and the decisions of states are driven by raison d'etat, cynicism, and power calculations.
I want to pick up on something else that you said earlier regarding how genocide still bears the weight of the crime of crimes, and how, regardless of the circumstances the populations are facing, many communities want a genocide label attached to their suffering. And I think that there is some value in that, and obviously value to those communities, but victim and survivor communities who have experienced genocide have undertaken tremendous effort to ensure the recognition of that suffering through these determinations, for better or worse. Could you share why it's so important from both a symbolic and kind of policymaking perspective to recognize genocides?
I'm somewhat ambivalent about this proposition because I've seen how it can be a sort of a minor obsession for victimized groups. For example, I've seen this with Tamil students in Australia who came to me after one of my genocide classes and said, how do we get our the destruction of the Tamil independence movement in 2009, in which there were hundreds of thousands of casualties. It was a brutal suppression, very similar to what we're seeing in Gaza. And hardly talked about in the international community. So they do feel invisible, and so they want to be seen visible and want some kind of justice. And for them, the winning of the genocide label is the key to this. And the reason they think that is they go, it's almost fantastical anti-Semitic imagination. They go, how did Jewish people manage to get this prominence? Like, what's their secret? And how come we're all talking about the Holocaust but not talking about our case? I mean, this was said to me verbatim by 19-year-old students. I said, the recognition of the Holocaust isn't a PR victory. I mean, this is, it's not a PR campaign that led to the fact that the Holocaust has its prominence in European and global memory. I mean, the Holocaust, in which between 5 and 6 million Jewish people in Europe were murdered, is also the largest murder of children in world history. Except in cases like, for example, the Great Leap Forward, in which maybe 40 million people died in this sort of contrived starvation in the late 50s and early 60s in China. And all these so-called Christian nations in Europe were complicit, well, many of them, in one way or the other. I mean, this was a civilizational collapse, at least for the West, or for Europe, of unprecedented proportions. So it's little surprise that it would make an impact on those cultures. I mean, what is interesting is how the Holocaust has become a global memory, and that's something that you might need another interview to talk about. There's a book about this, various books about this that are worth pondering. Now, I felt that these students were, on a fool's errand or a Sisyphean task, because recognition of genocide is not going to get you the diplomatic cover or support that you think. Just look at Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia recently with the ethnic cleansing of that enclave in Azerbaijan. The West didn't lift a finger because Azerbaijan is now a major energy supplier for Europe, and is also very close to Israel. It gets many of its arms from Israel. And in the end, geopolitics, and raw power, blood and iron, as Bismarck said, and not moral speeches and commitments drive state action. So I know Armenians were delighted when Biden recognized the Armenian genocide several years ago, and there are memorials about the Armenian genocide throughout LA and other parts. But when push comes to shove, the White House and the State Department and their equivalents in other states aren't going to take these things as guiding policy. It's going to be power, energy, military considerations, and so forth. Now, on the other side of the ledger, I do understand why victim communities, especially from small nations, which experience their existence in world history as precarious and tenuous, meaning that their existence could be snuffed out by great powers next to them at any moment. And that applies to the band of small countries between the Baltic and the Black Sea, the post-Ottoman states in the Balkans and the Middle East and so forth. And genocide is so attractive as a claim because it's a crime against identity. Its fixation or the target or the protected groups are ethnic, racial, or religious groups, not a civilian population, as you get in crimes against humanity. So victims experience the attacks on them as attacks on them because they are Rohingya, just because they're Rohingya. And once again, that is an archetype that comes from the Holocaust, where its distinctiveness, it is argued, is that Jews were attacked just because they are Jews, for who they are, not for anything they've done. And according to those that run the uniqueness of the Holocaust argument, they'll say that, well, in these other cases, people were attacked because members of their group participated in an insurgency, and they're kind of implying they deserved it, which I think is a highly problematic argument. The fact of the matter is that yes, the Myanmar military did attack innocent women and children in the Rohingya population and men uh, in 2017 and persecuted them before that. But they did so, yes, because they were Rohingya, but within their own mind, this is not a hate crime, not driven by hate, although hate accompanies it. It's driven by security measures. So, I call this notion permanent security. It's a negative utopian, it's a dystopian project of absolute safety, but no state is entitled to that. And if they try to gain it, then they'll be committing, massive crimes, and we're witnessing that now around the world. So the logics that drive these crimes are actually these utopian or dystopian security concerns, and they are accompanied by hate and contempt of the victim group, who are seen as having risen up and betrayed the motherland or what have you. They're experienced by the victim group, and certainly those that survive it, as solely driven by hate. And that's what the genocide concept captures. So I think, you have two issues there. One is that genocide is a crime against identity, against group existence, but it's also, unfortunately, the crime of crimes, in my view, unfortunately. So at the top of the hierarchy, and comes with this promise that, then one finally has recognition and, some kind of dignity, which I do understand intuitively. I don't think it gives a diplomatic cover, as I've mentioned, but I understand that this is important for victim groups. And I'll give you an example, because it has two effects. On the roof of the New South Wales Parliament in Sydney, where I come from, there is a small plaque or monument to the Armenian genocide, because one member of the Legislative Assembly had many Armenians living in his among his constituents, and he managed to sort of get this through as a regulation or a law, or at least through the parliament's procedures. Now, obviously, the Turkish community were up in arms, but they couldn't prevent it. Now, it's experienced by the Turkish community and by the Turkish diplomats there as a stigma, and their reasoning is that we didn't commit genocide, the Nazis committed genocide. So once again, you'll get this Holocaust analogizing going on. We rescued Jews during the Holocaust, so the Turkish argument goes, and so we never committed anything like what the Nazis did. What happened during the First World War, when the Armenian genocide took place, they allege, was an armed conflict, a sort of a civil war within the Ottoman Empire, in the context of invasions by Russian and Allied troops. And this was all very unfortunate, and there were deaths on both sides. So once again, they sort of run an armed conflict argument very similar to what the Israelis are running today. In fact, there are all kinds of parallels between the Armenian genocide and what's happening in Gaza. And I'm hoping that we publish an article about it in the Journal of Genocide Research. I'm not saying they're exactly the same, but there's quite a lot of points of contact. Because you get this standoff or rivalry between a genocide-run argument or an armed conflict argument, when in fact they're both. So, as you can see, I'm sort of torn on this issue, and but I would never be one to stand up before a community and say, you're forbidden to call this genocide. I abjure that guru role, which is sometimes ascribed to academics, and I know some academics succumb to the temptation of playing that role of saying, well, that's a genocide, but this is not a genocide, as if there's some kind of God. So in the end, the courts thrash these things out, and in my own scholarship, I'm trying to aid, to the extent that they'd ever read anything I write, but they would, try to educate or inform the judges that, the concepts you're working with are highly problematic. and that empirically logics of destruction and defeat, one is genocidal and one is military, are entwined and very difficult to pull apart. So if you're going to argue that there's not genocide in Gaza, it's just an armed conflict in which, say, crimes against humanity and war crimes have been committed, as the ICC is running, then you're allowing states to utterly destroy a territory, lay it waste, and then, make plans to expel its population, and argue that this is not somehow destruction in the meaning of the Genocide Convention. If that's the case, then what's the point of the Genocide Convention? It's a useless piece of paper and should never have been passed.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Expert Voices on Atrocity Prevention. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, or Spotify, and we'd be grateful if you left us a review. For more information on the Global Center's work on R2P, mass atrocity prevention, and populations at risk of mass atrocities, visit our website at www.globalr2p.org and connect with us on Facebook, Blue Sky, or LinkedIn at GCR2P.